So in my previous 3 lecture videos, we discussed evolution and natural selection, the importance of biodiversity, and threats. For this final lecture video for this module, I'm going to discuss the preservation of biodiversity. So treaties, laws, and techniques that we use to protect species, genetic diversity, ecosystem diversity. Now for this one, I wrote, refer to your textbook for details on the following legislative acts, but I will give you brief information in this video. So the first one is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. CITES is what we call it. Now, first of all, fauna refers to animals, whereas flora refers to plants. And actually, fauna refers to more than just animals, but it's like non-plant organisms. Now, CITES was put in place on an international level to restrict the trade in endangered species. So there's actually 3 parts of CITES. So there is no commercial trade or the movement of endangered species across international boundaries. That is prohibited. And this includes endangered species, but the second part is that it also includes species that are threatened or in danger of becoming like few in number. Now, finally, CITES requires a certification process when you're going to be moving animal or plant related products across international boundaries. So essentially it is a way to stop trade in these organisms so that they're not depleted. Now there is a huge black market for organisms that are protected under CITES. There's still a really lucrative trade in a lot of these, either living organisms or products that come from these organisms. Now, the Endangered Species Act, or the ESA, pertains to the United States. And what the ESA says is that you cannot develop land or in any way degrade an ecosystem that contains an endangered species in it. Now, this is a very controversial act, and different political groups are constantly trying to weaken the Endangered Species Act. So first of all, in order for a species to be declared endangered here in the United States, it has to be done by, I believe it's US Fish and Wildlife Service. And this is politically motivated oftentimes. For instance, we have delisted the wolf, the gray wolf in the Yellowstone region, because people want to hunt it, and the ranchers surrounding Yellowstone are very upset because they think the wolves are preying on their cattle. And so due to pressure, the wolf was what we call delisted several years ago, and hunting of these wolves has increased steadily since then. Now, the other reason that the ESA is controversial is, let's say you buy some land, undeveloped land. Before you develop that land, you have to have a wildlife biologist come in and make sure there are no endangered species. And if they find one, you are no longer allowed to develop your land. Now, there is a loophole to that. If you can buy a similar land or habitat and relocate that endangered species, then you can develop your land. Now, finally, we have the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Now, this is between the United States and Canada, which makes it illegal to hunt migratory birds. And that includes about 1,100 species. Now, there are non-legislative ways of trying to preserve biodiversity. Well, somewhat non-legislative. So we have established preserves around the world. right? There are some in the United States, but there are many reserves or preserves that have been set aside throughout the world. Now, what these do is restrict certain activities within the boundaries that will endanger the species or the ecosystems that are contained in the preserve. Now, I wrote here, what is a biodiversity hotspot? Now, biodiversity hotspots are in red on this map here. Now, a biodiversity hotspot is an area that has, I think it's something like 70% of the species within a hotspot have to be endemic to that area, meaning that they occur in that area and nowhere else. And the biodiversity hotspot, we used to classify it based on vegetation, but I believe that they have extended this definition. Now, hotspots are protected by an organization called Conservation International. Well, they are the ones who advocate for setting aside hotspot areas. Now, what I want you to notice here is there is the California Floristic Province. So California actually contains one of these hotspots. It's an interesting state because there's different types of ecosystems all in one state. So you have grasslands in the Central Valley. There are some desert areas. You have coniferous forest, or, you know, like pine trees, things like that. So they declared part of it a biodiversity hotspot. Now, another technique, and this is habitat restoration. And this is a technique that I've worked on with my research on pollinators. And so basically you are bringing back an area to a state that can support native organisms. Now, I believe I changed that definition from the one in your book. A lot of times people think of habitat restoration as restoring a habitat to its original state, but that is usually impossible. So we just want to restore it to a state that supports a lot of the organisms that used to live there. So I included a video, Saving Ocean Biodiversity, and this is on coral restoration. So we are losing a huge percentage of our coral reefs. However, there are people working to regrow a lot of this coral, and it seems to be having an effect. So I would like you to watch this video as an example. Now, many of you, I mean, you've all heard of zoos, and many of you have visited the Phoenix Zoo, and a lot of zoos maybe have a bad reputation. You don't agree with taking wild animals, putting them in a zoo, and there are pros and cons, certainly. But many zoos participate in conservation by having captive breeding programs, meaning that they breed an endangered organism and release a lot of those individuals back into the wild. So what I put here is the Phoenix Zoo has the Arizona Center for Nature Conservation. Now, this is a black-footed ferret in the picture here, and this is the most endangered mammal in North America. They are almost extinct. However, over the last 30 years, the Phoenix Zoo has bred 500, or through breeding, 500 kits have been produced, and many of those have been reintroduced to the wild. Now, also the Phoenix Zoo brought the Arabian oryx. It's kind of like this antelope-looking animal with huge horns. They brought the Arabian oryx back from the brink of extinction. Okay, these were almost eradicated. I think there were maybe 100 individuals left. And through captive breeding and reintroduction to the wild, we've now established oryx populations again. And the Phoenix Zoo has been credited with that effort. Now, another part of this, and this is not in my slide, but it is in your textbook, is what we call a species survival plan. And so all zoos and wild animal parks, if they're accredited, belong to the species survival plan. So they keep stud books and stored sperm and eggs from their endangered species, and then they maybe take sperm from, let's say, an orangutan in the Phoenix Zoo and combine it with eggs that comes from an orangutan in a different zoo. That way we are keeping genetic diversity. And that is very, very important if we're going to save a species. Inbreeding causes health issues. And so any organization participating in captive breeding and reintroduction has to belong to the species survival plan. So this is the end of your module presentation. So I urge you to go back and watch all of the videos I've included. They're very interesting and give you a lot of insight into the efforts, the threats, but also the efforts to conserve biodiversity.